Hello everyone, and for this video I'm going to be talking about systemic racism because I believe it's a key issue in today's world. And I was watching a video on a white guy talking about systemic racism and how it's not real in the US and so on and so on and so on. He was just talking a lot and I didn't agree with it. So I wanted to give a brief history lesson on systemic racism in the US, provide any information, any knowledge that people want to educate themselves with. And yeah, so we're going to start by going 200 years back in time to the end of the Civil War, 1865. And at the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment came to light where slavery was abolished in 1866. And it was signed off by Abraham Lincoln in Congress. Now, even though slavery was abolished, it didn't stop the mistreatment of black people in the US, mistreatment of African Americans. So what happened was that in the South, they were issuing black codes during this Reconstruction period of 1967 to 1977. And black codes were basically vacancy laws. And what they meant is that if you were African American, you had to provide evidence of where you worked and what your job was. And if they weren't approved, then you'd be forced into work or sent to prison. Now, during this time period, during the Reconstruction period, there was also a key event called the Colfax Massacre that happened in Louisiana, outside a courthouse where the White League issued the murder of 150 African Americans and 3 white people. Now, the White League is different to the KKK because they were very open about their racism. They would literally tell you to your face their opinion of you and how they viewed white supremacy and white superiority, whereas the KKK are more underground and they're not as massive as the White League were back in the time. The White League were a private organisation, so the government really didn't have much control over them as well during the time period. So that happened, and then after that, the Civil Rights Act was implemented in 1875. And the Civil Rights Act meant that there was no segregation in public transport, restaurants, and so on. But this still existed in southern states like Louisiana, Virginia, and so on. They still segregated most parts of the states. So that happened in 1875, and then moving on a year later, there was what's known as an election sellout, where Southern Democrats gave their votes to Southern Republicans. And because of this, military oppression was removed from the South, because after the Civil War, the Union basically occupied the South to ensure that they were obeying the law and not mistreating black people. Because after the Civil War, many black people were working in the federal government, they were working normal jobs, and they were basically living life as it should be, normal, even though there was still some oppression from the southern states, obviously. And moving on to 1896, which is another key event because there's a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Homer Plessy was a man who was 1/8 African American. And it was hard to tell his race or ethnicity, so before going on public transport, when he tried to take the train operator asked him for his race. He told him he was 1/8 African American, and the train operator said, no, you can't board this train, because obviously segregation still existed in the South. Plessy lost his case, and this basically sparked the birth of the Jim Crow laws. I'm going to do another video on Jim Crow laws, but it's basically laws that revolved around segregation of African Americans and white people. And you can evidently see which of the two races got the better end of the stick because of these Jim Crow laws. Now, early 1900s. So, as I mentioned before, African Americans were working in the federal government and so on in the 1870s because of the Reconstruction period. However, and they had voting rights. I forgot to mention that. They had voting rights as well. However, by the 1900s, only 0.5% of African Americans were voting. And the reason for that is because of 3 key implementations within the Jim Crow laws, and that is poll taxes, grandfather clause, and literacy and comprehension tests. And I'll explain all 3 of them briefly. So poll taxes were basically taxes that meant that you had to pay to vote. And because many African Americans couldn't afford that, they weren't allowed to vote. Now, we move on to literacy and comprehension tests. Now, because of the Jim Crow laws, public schools were segregated. So African Americans got less education than white people, and the education was far more inferior than white people's. Therefore, they were very less educated. And then you got the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause is basically, as I forgot to mention this. Now, because there are loads of poor white people as well, to ensure that white people could vote, they issued the grandfather clause. So if your grandfather voted, that meant you can vote. And because many African Americans at the time, their ancestors were evidently slaves, they didn't vote at all. Therefore, the grandfather clause didn't apply to them. So you can see where I'm going with this. They literally blocked every pathway to voting that African Americans had. That's why only 0.5% voted them at the time. Now, a lot more happened between then to what the next period in time I'm going to talk to you, but this would be a long ass video. So I'm going to go straight to 1946, which is basically an event that occurred that sparked the civil rights movement that everyone knows of today, led by Martin Luther King Jr. So in 1946 in South Carolina, a war veteran by the name of Isaac Woodward Jr. was beaten basically to death. I mean, he didn't die, but he was basically beaten to the point where he was dead by a person. But because of white superiority, you could still get away with literally anything, even murder. And many murder cases white people got away with at the time just because of the complexion of their skin. And many black people were convicted of things they didn't even do just because of the complexion of their skin. Now, there's a lot that went on between the early 1900s and the 1940s that I'll probably do in another video. But we're moving on to one of the key and most memorable moments in the history of civil rights, the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And this started in 1955 by the Montgomery bus boycott, where it was successful. Martin Luther King basically and a group of African Americans boycotted the bus transportations and eventually led them to being desegregated so that African Americans could ride the bus again. And there's a lot of marches that took place as well, like the Birmingham campaign, the March on Selma, and throughout this time period. And then one of the most memorable ones is the March on Washington, where he had his famous I Have a Dream speech. This I Have a Dream speech is very iconic today, as Martin Luther King basically gave a speech on explaining how he had a dream that there would be no more segregation. White and black people can get along just as one human race. And this speech was in front of 200 to 300,000 people and was the largest civil rights movement speech at the time. And that was very key in history because it led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, and the Voting Rights Act signed in 1965. Now, that was about 200 years of history. Well, not really 200, more like 100 years of history of civil rights in America. And you can kind of pinpoint the systemic racism throughout this time period because the Jim Crow laws led to a lot of African Americans being uneducated, and then their predecessors being uneducated as well, and so on and so on. Now, how is this relevant in today? And I say how is this relevant today is because nothing much has changed since the Civil Rights Movement. And the reason why I say that is because the police are still brutally murdering black people in the US, and that's a fact that you can't argue that with all the evidence pointed to it. And also the handle of justice. And I want to compare two cases. So first of all, I want to compare Ahmaud Arbery. He was shot literally while he was jogging by two white men, and he was unarmed. I must admit that as well. He was unarmed, just so everyone knows, and pretty much everyone does know he was unarmed. And then there's also George Floyd, who was murdered in broad daylight with the officer Derek Chauvin's knee pressed against his neck. Even though he was screaming, "I can't breathe," the officer told him to relax and continue to press his knee. And the other officers are no better. I'm just gonna say that now. The other officers know better. The other two that was pressing their knee on his body, and the Asian officer who didn't even wanna help. He didn't even wanna say anything. Even though there was a lot of oppression that went on in Asia, Southeast Asia, throughout history as well, he couldn't empathize one bit with George Floyd. And I didn't mean to compare them to, I meant to compare them to another thing. And what I'm going to compare them to is, if you remember, there was a school shooting that happened in Florida by a boy named Nikola Cruz. Now, Nikola Cruz was armed. He was dangerous. He was going around shooting people. And do you know how the police dealt with him? They told him to drop his gun and arrested him. They literally didn't do anything severe that could have caused him damage. And do you know what his defense was in court? Nikola Cruz's defense was he's suffering from a mental illness. Now, I don't know about you, but this clearly points as evidence to systemic racism in the justice system in the United States. I also need to mention that Ahmaud Arbery was black, George Floyd was black, Nikola Cruz was white. And you can see how they were dealt differently. Now, there's a lot of evidence that points to police brutality in the US. However, the President of the United States doesn't seem to care. Even, especially at a time during where he needs black votes the most, he still labels protesters as thugs. And, well, I'm going to go into a whole nother video about Donald Trump because that video is going to be very long. But anyway, my point is, there's still systemic racism in the justice system in the United States. And for some reason, the men in power can't see that. They either can't see the difference in treatment between minorities and white people, or they're choosing to ignore it. That is basically two sides of the coin. And that is basically what I want to talk about today, because otherwise I'll be going on a big, huge rant. But yeah, I covered why systemic racism is important in the history of the US. I talked about key events that happened in the terrorism bill that's happening in my hometown, my home country of the Philippines, because I'm half Filipino. And yeah, so stay tuned to my next video. Please like, subscribe. I hope this helped. And I promise I'll conduct myself more efficiently in the future. It was just hard because I get quite emotional over topics like this, because when you have a sense of morality and you know what's right and what's wrong, you're seeing other people not feel the same way about the situation that you feel. It gets you frustrated, it makes you angry, and makes you feel all other emotions and so on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some petitions, some donation links in the description below. Please donate, please sign petitions towards Black Lives Matter and help get the justice that black people deserve in the US. Justice should be everywhere. I mean, that's the whole point of the legal system. Yeah, I'll be talking about racism in the UK in another video as well, because I don't want to seem like I'm biased in terms of the US and UK, because I care about what happens in my own country as well. But yeah, please like, please subscribe, and if you enjoyed the video, stay tuned.